The elevator in the luxurious Los Feliz condominium in Los Angeles ascended silently for 16 floors to the penthouse, carrying in Charles Chuck Miller back home on a Thursday that should have been like any other. His hands were still slightly trembling from the adrenaline of the meeting in San Francisco, a 3-hour presentation that resulted in a $20 million investment for his financial consulting firm. Chuck adjusted his Italian tie as the doors opened onto the Carrara marble hallway that led to his residence. At 45, he had built an empire from nothing, rising from a 2-bedroom apartment in Greenwich Village to this 4,000-square-foot mansion with panoramic views of the Hollywood Hills. The key turned in the golden lock with the same metallic sound as always, but something was different. The silence of the house seemed dense, charged with a tension he couldn't identify. Stephanie should have been at the spa in the Chateau Marmont, as she was every Thursday at 3 in the afternoon. He put his Hermes briefcase on the mahogany sideboard and loosened the knot of his tie. The central air conditioning maintained a perfect temperature, but a cold sweat ran down his forehead. There was something wrong with this stillness. That's when he heard it. First, a sharp scream from the kitchen. Then a voice he knew well, Stephanie's voice, but with a tone he had never heard before. A cruel, venomous tone that made his skin crawl. "You incompetent fool! Do you think I'm an idiot? Look at this stain!" Chuck walked toward the screams, his steps silent on the hardwood floor. With every foot the words became clearer, more violent. His mind struggled to process what he was hearing. Stephanie never spoke to anyone like that. She was delicate, polite, refined. "Get down on your knees and clean it properly, you worthless piece of trash!" Chuck's heart raced. Who was being humiliated like this in his own home? He neared the entrance to the kitchen, and what he saw made him stop as if he'd been punched in the gut. Maria, the employee who had worked for them for 8 years, was on her knees on the white porcelain floor, scrubbing with trembling hands. Her navy blue uniform was torn at the right shoulder, and Chuck noticed she had a slight limp when she moved. Stephanie stood beside her, in a white linen dress that had cost $3,000, with her arms crossed and an expression of disdain that Chuck had never seen on her face. "Clean it all again, and this time do it right, you damned—" "Stephanie!" Chuck's voice echoed through the kitchen like thunder. Stephanie turned, her eyes wide, and for a split second he saw something that frightened him. There was no surprise in her gaze, only the quick calculation of someone who'd been caught red-handed. "Carlos, it's so good you got home early." Her voice instantly changed, returning to the sweet melodic tone he knew. "I was just supervising the cleaning. You know how much of a perfectionist I am." Chuck looked at the floor where Maria was still kneeling. There was no stain. The floor was spotless, shining under the recessed LED lights. "What stain?" he asked, his voice dangerously low. Stephanie hesitated for a second, but it was enough. "Oh, she spilled coffee here a while ago. I just wanted to make sure it was really clean." Chuck knelt beside Maria, who kept her eyes fixed on the floor. He ran his hand over the smooth, cold surface of the porcelain. Nothing, not the slightest trace of moisture. "Maria, can you please get up?" The 42-year-old woman slowly got to her feet, avoiding their eyes. Chuck noticed the red mark on her right knee, where she had been kneeling on the hard floor for a long time. "Stephanie, can I speak to you alone?" Chuck's tone didn't allow for discussion. Stephanie followed him to his office in silence, and when the door closed behind them, Chuck Miller's world began to crumble. But he didn't yet know that this was just the beginning of a discovery that would change his life forever. Chuck's office was his personal sanctuary, walls covered in English leather, a 100-year-old mahogany desk, and a prime view of Central Park. It was there he made the most important decisions of his business life. He never imagined he would make the most important decision of his personal life in the same environment. Stephanie sat in the burgundy velvet armchair in front of the desk, crossing her legs with the natural elegance that had captivated him 15 years ago at the opening cocktail party for his first company. Her blonde hair fell in perfect waves over her shoulders, and she maintained the serene smile she used at social events. "Chuck, darling, you're making a mountain out of a molehill," she said, smoothing a non-existent strand of hair. "Maria spilled coffee on the floor, and I just asked her to clean it. It's her job, isn't it?" Chuck stood behind his desk, his hands resting on the polished surface. He studied the face of the woman with whom he had shared the last 15 years, searching for some sign of the kind and loving person he thought he knew. "Stephanie, I checked the floor. There was no stain." "Of course not. She cleaned it." The floor was completely dry. If coffee had been spilled, it would still be damp. A tense silence fell over the room. Chuck could hear the ticking of the Swiss clock on the bookshelf and the low hum of the air conditioning. Stephanie looked away for the first time. "Well, maybe I overreacted," she admitted with a calculated sigh. "You know how stressed I am with the club meetings. Marcia won't stop criticizing our house, looking for flaws. That doesn't explain why you were screaming at Maria, or why her uniform was torn." Stephanie got up abruptly, her Christian Louboutin heels hitting the hardwood floor. "Chuck, honestly, are you insinuating that I mistreat our employee? After 15 years of marriage, do you really think I'd be capable of something like that?" The indignation in her voice sounded convincing, but Chuck had spent 2 decades analyzing people in complex negotiations. He knew how to recognize a lie. "Maria has never given us any reason for complaint in 8 years of work," he said slowly. "She's punctual, efficient, discreet. Why would you treat her that way?" "I didn't treat her any way. I just asked her to do her job properly." Chuck walked to the window, watching the cars on the Upper East Side. His business mind began to process the details he had observed, the exact position Maria was kneeling in, the red mark on her knee, the tear in her uniform, the way she avoided looking at him. "Stephanie, how often do you get home before 5 in the afternoon?" The question caught her by surprise. "What does that have to do with anything? Answer me, please." "Rarely. You know I have my activities, my friends." Chuck turned to look at her. "And how often do I get home before 7? "Never. You always get home after 7. Chuck, what are you getting at?" He didn't respond immediately. His mind was working, connecting dots he had preferred to ignore. The times he got home and found Maria with a more serious expression than usual, the occasions when the employee seemed startled when he appeared unexpectedly, the small signs he had attributed to work fatigue. "Stephanie, what really happens in this house when I'm not here?" She laughed, but the sound was forced, artificial. "Normal life happens in any house, Chuck. Maria cleans, I take care of my things, I manage our social life. Show me your right hand." "What?" "Your right hand. Show me." Stephanie hesitated before extending her hand. Chuck took it gently, examining her well-manicured fingers. There was a small red mark on the side of her index finger, as if she had been squeezing something tightly for a long time. "How did you get that?" "I don't know. It must have been when I was in the garden this morning." But Chuck knew Stephanie never worked in the garden. She was terrified of dirt and always said that's what gardeners were for. He let go of her hand and walked toward the office door. "I'm going to talk to Maria." "Chuck, wait!" Stephanie's voice went up an octave. "You can't just go out and interrogate our employee. What will the neighbors think?" He stopped with his hand on the doorknob. "Stephanie, you just got more worried about what the neighbors will think than about the well-being of a person who has worked in our home for 8 years. The silence that followed was telling. Chuck opened the door and walked out, leaving Stephanie alone in the office. He found Maria in the service area, organizing the clothes that had just arrived from the laundry. She turned quickly when she heard him approach, and Chuck noticed how she instinctively lowered her gaze. "Maria, I need to ask you some questions, and I want you to be completely honest with me." The woman nodded in silence, her hands trembling slightly as she folded a dress shirt. "How long has this been happening?" The question was direct, without preamble. Maria stopped folding the clothes and finally looked up to face him. In that gaze, Chuck saw everything he needed to know, and he knew his life had just taken a turn he had never imagined possible. The next day, a Friday, Chuck woke up at 5 in the morning with a plan. Stephanie was still sleeping soundly beside him, breathing softly and regularly, with a serene expression that contrasted sharply with the cruel woman he had discovered the day before. He dressed silently in the walk-in closet, choosing a charcoal gray Armani suit and a discreet tie. Today would be different from all the other days of the past 15 years. Today he would begin to discover who the woman he slept with every night really was. Chuck left the house at 6:15 as always, greeted the doorman, George, and got into his black BMW X6. But instead of heading downtown, he parked in the parking lot of the Plaza Hotel, just 5 blocks from his apartment. At 7:45, when he would normally already be at his office, Chuck was sitting in a Starbucks with a clear view of the entrance to his building. Stephanie always left for her morning activities at 9 o'clock sharp, 9:05. Stephanie's white Audi A4 pulled out of the garage and headed towards the Upper West Side. Chuck waited 10 more minutes before returning home. "Morning, George," he greeted the doorman, who seemed surprised to see him. "Morning, Mr. Miller. Did you forget something?" "Yeah, some important documents." Chuck went up the private elevator, his heart beating faster with each floor. When he opened the door to the house, silence greeted him like a heavy hug. Maria should be in the kitchen preparing lunch. He found her organizing the pantry, her movements cautious and precise. When she saw him, her eyes widened in surprise and something that looked like fear. "Mr. Miller, I didn't expect— Mrs. Stephanie said you wouldn't be back until tonight. Maria, sit here with me." He gestured to the kitchen table. "I want you to tell me everything, absolutely everything." Over the next hour, Chuck listened to stories that turned his stomach. Maria, her voice breaking, told him about months of systematic humiliation, how Stephanie made her clean the same place multiple times, always finding non-existent flaws, how she screamed at her for things she hadn't done, how she forced her to stay on her knees cleaning imaginary stains. "She told me if I told, she'd fire me without a reference," Maria whispered, wiping away a tear. "And with the economy, Mr. Miller, I can't afford to lose this job. I have 2 kids in school. Why didn't you come to me sooner? How could I, Mr. Miller? Who would believe an employee's word against the ladies?" The question hit Chuck like a slap. He realized that, without meaning to, he had created an environment where Maria felt it was impossible to seek help. The power difference was so great that she preferred to suffer in silence rather than risk losing her job. At 11 o'clock, Chuck returned to his office, but his mind was far from the financial reports waiting on his desk. He called down Jack Anderson, a private detective he had worked with on corporate fraud cases. "Jack, I need your help, but it's personal and extremely confidential." "Go ahead, Chuck. You know you can count on me. I need surveillance equipment for my own house, and a complete financial investigation of my wife's activities." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Jack Anderson had worked 40 years in the FBI before opening his investigation firm. He was used to unusual requests, but this one surprised him. "Chuck, are you sure about this? Investigating your own wife is— Jack, I've just discovered that the woman I've been living with for 15 years is completely different from the person I thought I knew. I need to know the truth." "Got it. What kind of equipment do you want?" "High-quality cameras and microphones strategically positioned. I want to document everything that happens in my house when I'm not present." "And the financial investigation?" "I want a complete trace of all her expenses for the last 6 months, credit cards, withdrawals, transfers, everything." At 4 in the afternoon, Jack and a specialized technician were at Chuck's mansion, installing tiny, virtually invisible equipment. Button-sized cameras were placed in the kitchen, the service area, and the main hallways. Ultra-sensitive microphones were hidden in decorative vases and behind paintings. "The system automatically records everything and sends it to a secure server," Jack explained. "You can access the recordings in real time from your phone or computer." "And how long will the financial investigation take?" "To get a full picture, about 2 weeks. But I can give you some preliminary information on Monday." When Stephanie arrived home at 6 in the afternoon, with shopping bags from a Beverly Hills boutique, she found Chuck working quietly in his office, as if it were a perfectly normal day. "How was your day, darling?" she asked, giving him a kiss on the forehead. "Productive," he replied, without looking up from his papers. "And yours?" "Oh, the usual. Hair salon, lunch with the girls, some shopping." Chuck nodded, but his mind was focused on the newly installed devices that, from now on, would register every word, every gesture, every moment of Stephanie's secret life. On Monday, at 8:45 in the morning, Chuck was in his office when he received the first notification on his phone. The monitoring app sent an alert. Activity detected in the kitchen. He opened the video stream, and what he saw made his blood run cold. Stephanie was screaming at Maria, forcing her to clean the stovetop that was already spotless. But this time, Chuck could hear every word, every humiliation, every cruel command, and he realized he was just beginning to unveil the full extent of his wife's cruelty. Over the next 2 weeks, Chuck developed a routine he never imagined would be part of his life, waking up every morning and checking the recordings from the night before. Each new video file was like opening a door to a parallel universe that existed in his own home. Monday, 9:23 a.m. Stephanie forcing Maria to refold all the bathroom towels because they were supposedly not symmetrical. The towels were perfectly folded, but Stephanie deliberately messed them up and demanded they be refolded. Tuesday, 2:17 p.m. Stephanie deliberately spilling sugar on the kitchen floor and forcing Maria to clean it with her hands, claiming the vacuum cleaner made too much noise and disturbed her meditation. Wednesday, 11:34 a.m. The most disturbing scene so far. Stephanie took an expensive flower vase and threw it on the living room floor, shattering it into dozens of pieces. Then she called Maria, screaming that she had broken it by carelessness, and forced her to clean the pieces with her bare hands. Chuck saw his employee cut her fingers on the ceramic fragments as Stephanie watched with a cold smile. Chuck watched those videos in the silence of his office, his hands trembling with rage. The woman in the recordings was a monster he had never seen. When he got home at night, Stephanie was again the loving and elegant wife, asking about his day, commenting on the dinner prepared by Maria, complaining about her frivolous club friends. On Thursday, Jack Anderson showed up at his office with a brown folder full of documents. His face was serious, and Chuck knew the news wouldn't be good. "Chuck, sit down. I need to show you some things." Jack opened the folder and spread bank statements, credit card bills, and financial reports on the mahogany desk. There were red marks all over them. "Let's start with the basic expenses. How much do you authorize per month for Stephanie to manage the house?" $15,000. $5 for Maria's salary and Social Security, $10 for general household expenses. "And you think Maria receives $3,000 a month?" "Of course. That's what I authorize for her salary." Jack took a sheet of paper and showed it to Chuck. "Maria receives exactly $1,500 a month for the past 6 months. Chuck's eyes widened. "How is that possible? I authorize $3,000. Stephanie is only transferring half to Maria. The other $1,500, well, I'm going to show you where it goes." Jack opened another folder with receipts. Stephanie's salon in Beverly Hills, $2,000 a month. Personal trainer, $1,500. Masseuse, $800. Aesthetic treatments at the Beauty and Wellness Clinic, $2,500. But those are her personal expenses. Exactly. She's using the money intended for Maria's salary to pay for personal luxuries. Chuck felt as if he had been punched in the stomach. How much is she diverting per month? Of the $15,000 authorized, she's diverting around $8,000 for unauthorized personal expenses, in addition to the $1,500 from Maria's salary. So $9,500 a month. That's right. In 6 months, she's diverted $57,000. Chuck leaned back in his chair, trying to process the information. Stephanie was not only psychologically humiliating Maria, but also financially stealing from her. "There's more," Jack continued. "Look at this statement from your company's corporate credit card. What do you see here?" Chuck examined the transactions. Meals at the Grill, at Per Se, dinner at Daniel. Those are the restaurants Stephanie frequents with her friends. Now look at the description she gave the company's accounting department. Chuck read the descriptions and felt sick. Domestic employee food expenses, house maintenance costs, food for work events. She's declaring her personal dinners as Maria's and the house's expenses. Look at this one here. Dinner at 11 Madison Park, $340, described as employees' weekly food. Maria earns $1,500 a month, and Stephanie is declaring that she spends $340 on one dinner. Exactly, and there's more. Stephanie is also using the story of the economic crisis to justify the reduction in Maria's salary. She told her that you ordered the cut due to the company's financial difficulties. Chuck stood up abruptly, starting to pace back and forth in his office. "Maria believes it was me who cut her salary. From the conversation I had with her, yes. Stephanie told her you were worried about finances and that everyone would have to make sacrifices." Chuck's rage was reaching dangerous levels. Not only was Stephanie stealing from Maria and humiliating her, but she was also using his name to justify the cruelty. "Jack, I need more proof. Irrefutable proof. What do you have in mind?" Chuck thought for a moment, his business mind calculating strategies. "I'm going to organize a dinner party at home, a dinner with important, respectable people. I want Stephanie to be publicly exposed. It's risky, Chuck. If it goes wrong, it won't go wrong. Stephanie is too arrogant to control herself when she feels in control. She'll expose herself." Jack put the papers back in the folder. "And after? What do you intend to do with all this evidence?" Chuck looked out his office window, watching the traffic on Broadway. Normal people living their normal lives, unaware that on the 16th floor of a commercial building, a man was discovering that his entire life was a lie. "First, I'll give Stephanie the chance to confess everything and repair the damage. If she refuses, Chuck turned to Jack, and the detective saw something in his eyes that made him instinctively step back. It was the cold, calculating expression that had made Chuck Miller one of the most respected and feared businessmen in New York. "If she refuses, I'm going to destroy her reputation as systematically as she destroyed Maria's dignity." Jack nodded in silence. He had known Chuck long enough to know that when he made a decision, nothing in the world would make him change his mind. The war was declared. Stephanie just didn't know it yet. Chuck spent the weekend planning every detail as if it were a military operation. On Monday, he called his private secretary, Martha Akin Cisnar, a 50-year-old woman who had organized his social life for over a decade. "Martha, I need to organize a dinner party at home for Thursday. Something elegant, but intimate. 8 people maximum. May I suggest some names from your contact list, Mr. Miller? Actually, I have specific guests in mind. I want you to invite the Bankam, Johnson Xanpan, Robert Arden, and Patricia R. They own the Fresh Market supermarket chain. I know them, very respected in New York society. I also want David and Mary Thompson from the Thompson & Associates Construction Company. And, most importantly, I want the state senator Anthony Pirellis and his wife, Lucia." Martha paused, surprised. "Senator Pirelli? He's very hard to get, Mr. Miller. His schedule—" "Tell him, I want to discuss a bill on the working conditions of domestic employees in New York. He'll be interested." And he was. Anthony Pirelli was known for his advocacy of labor rights and had been the sponsor of several laws protecting domestic workers in the state. His secretary called the same day, confirming his attendance. Chuck chose the menu personally, opting for sophisticated dishes that would require complex preparation and a lot of movement between the kitchen and the dining room. Herb-crusted grilled salmon, mushroom risotto, arugula salad with figs and goat cheese, and Belgian chocolate lava cake for dessert. "Stephanie will love this menu," he told Maria on Tuesday morning when he gave her the list of dishes. "It's the kind of menu she loves to serve to impress guests." Maria nodded, but Chuck noticed the concern in her eyes. "Mr. Miller, Mrs. Stephanie, she gets more demanding when we have important visitors." "I know, Maria, but I want you to know that no matter what happens on Thursday, you are protected." "Understood." The employee looked at him with a mixture of hope and fear. "Thank you, Mr. Miller." Chuck installed additional cameras in the outside area of the house, one in the garden, another in the pool area, and a third on the terrace that overlooked the service area. He wanted to document absolutely everything. On Wednesday night, during dinner, Chuck watched Stephanie planning every detail of the reception. She was radiant, talking about the wines she would serve, the flowers she had ordered, the Versace dress she would wear. "Chuck, darling, you've made a perfect choice of guests. Senator Pirelli and his wife are such refined people, and the Johnsons are just lovely." "I'm sure it will be a memorable night," Chuck replied, and he wasn't lying. Thursday arrived with a perfect blue sky. Chuck left for work as always, but he spent the entire day monitoring the cameras from his phone. Stephanie was in her element, supervising every detail of the preparation. At 2 in the afternoon, Chuck saw through the cameras the moment he had been waiting for. Stephanie entered the kitchen where Maria was preparing the salmon and began to scream. "This isn't good enough. Do you think you can serve this garbage to Senator Pirelli? Do it all over again." Maria tried to explain that the salmon was perfectly seasoned and cooked, but Stephanie interrupted her. "Shut up and obey. You're paid to do what I tell you, not to question." Chuck recorded everything, knowing that in a few hours his guests would see his wife's true nature with their own eyes. At 7, Chuck arrived home to find an impeccable residence. The lights were perfectly adjusted, the flowers elegantly arranged, the table set with the Limoges porcelain and Baccarat crystal they had received as a wedding gift. Stephanie was stunning in her black Versace dress, with a pearl necklace that had cost $40,000. Her hair was immaculate, her makeup perfect. She was the image of the sophisticated hostess. "You look beautiful," Chuck said, giving her a kiss on the cheek. "Thank you, darling. I'm sure this will be one of our best parties." The guests began to arrive at 8. Robert and Patricia Johnson. He, a robust man of 60 who had built a retail empire. She, an elegant woman involved in several charitable causes. David and Mary Thompson, renowned architects responsible for some of the most important buildings in New York. And finally, at 8:15, Senator Anthony Pirelli and his wife Lucia arrived. Pirelli was a tall man with a grey beard, known for his integrity and defense of human rights. Lucia was a social worker and coordinated a project to support vulnerable women. For the first hour, everything went perfectly. Stephanie was the ideal hostess, maintaining intelligent conversations, serving sophisticated cocktails, making everyone feel special. Chuck watched her, admiring her ability to play the part of the perfect wife. Maria served discreetly, going unnoticed by the guests. Chuck noticed how she moved silently, anticipating needs, keeping glasses full and plates organized. At 9:30, Chuck gave the first sign. "Maria, would you please take the garbage out of the kitchen? It's starting to smell a bit." It was a lie. There was no smell at all. But it was the signal he had been waiting for. Maria left through the kitchen door carrying 2 garbage bags, heading to the outdoor area where the containers were. 5 minutes later, Patricia Johnson commented that she wanted to see the garden that Stephanie always praised. "Of course, darling," Stephanie said. "Let's take a look outside." 6 people went out to the garden, leaving Chuck and Senator Pirelli talking in the living room about the economy. Through the window, Chuck could see the group approaching the area where Maria was placing the garbage bags. His phone vibrated with a notification from the cameras. The show was about to begin. Through the panoramic window of the living room, Chuck watched Stephanie leading the group of guests through the illuminated garden. The LED lights highlighted the rare orchids and imperial palms she was so proud to show off. Senator Pirelli was by her side, commenting on the sustainability of the automated irrigation. "An impressive system, Stephanie," Robert Johnson said, admiring the landscaping. "It must have cost a fortune." "Oh, you know how it is," Stephanie replied with false modesty. "Chuck always says our house is our calling card." It was at that moment that Maria appeared in the side service area, carrying the garbage bags. She was limping slightly, a consequence of having been kneeling for hours that morning cleaning the same area multiple times at Stephanie's insistence. The group in the garden had not yet noticed her presence. Maria headed toward the garbage containers, moving discreetly so as not to bother the guests. But Chuck knew Stephanie had seen her, and like a predator smelling blood, Stephanie excused herself from the guests and walked toward the employee. "Maria!" Her voice cut through the night air like a knife. "What are you doing out there with that sour face? Don't you see we have important visitors?" The group of guests stopped instantly. Chuck saw Lucia Pirelli, the senator's wife, frown with discomfort. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Stephanie," Maria murmured, quickening her pace to finish her task. "I'm sorry isn't enough. Look how disheveled you are. You look like you just came out of a slum." The silence in the garden became awkward. Mary Thompson exchanged a meaningful look with her husband. Patricia Johnson took a step toward Stephanie, clearly upset. "Stephanie, maybe we should go back inside," she suggested diplomatically. But Stephanie was in her element, feeling powerful in front of an audience. No. It's important for them to see how difficult it is to maintain a well-organized house with careless employees. Maria tried to exit the scene, but Stephanie called her back. "Hey, I'm not done talking to you. Come back here." The employee slowly turned, and under the garden lights everyone could clearly see the red marks on her arms and the way she favored one leg when she walked. "Stephanie," Lucia Pirelli's voice was firm and cold. "What are those marks on her arms?" "Oh, she's very clumsy. She always hurts herself." "Maria," Lucia addressed the employee directly, completely ignoring Stephanie. "How did you hurt yourself?" Maria looked nervously at Stephanie, then at the guests. I tripped, ma'am." "Where?" In the kitchen." "Doing what?" The question was asked with the precision of a prosecutor interrogating a witness. Lucia Pirelli had spent 20 years working with victims of abuse and knew how to recognize the signs. "Cleaning the floor," Maria replied in a low voice. "On your knees?" Stephanie quickly intervened. "Lucia, darling, I think we're giving too much importance to a small domestic accident. Should we go back to the living room?" But Lucia didn't move. "Maria, how long have you been working for this family?" 8 years, ma'am. "And have they always treated you like this?" The question fell into the garden like a lightning bolt. Stephanie paled, finally realizing she had lost control of the situation. "Lucia, what are you insinuating?" Stephanie tried to laugh, but the sound was forced and hysterical. "Maria is almost family." "Maria," Lucia continued, completely ignoring Stephanie, "are you afraid of your boss?" The silence that followed was deafening. Chuck watched from the window as Maria struggled between the need to tell the truth and the fear of losing her job. It was Robert Johnson who broke the silence. "Stephanie, I think it's best we leave." "Robert, there's no need." Stephanie tried to protest. "Yes, there is," he replied firmly. "Patricia, let's go." Senator Pirelli approached Stephanie, his expression grave. "Stephanie, I sincerely hope you reflect on what we've witnessed here tonight. The dignified treatment of domestic employees is a matter of basic human rights." "Anthony, you're exaggerating." "I'm not exaggerating at all." His voice was cold as ice. "I've been working for 15 years defending laws to protect domestic workers precisely to prevent situations like this." One by one, the guests said their goodbyes coldly and left. Chuck walked them to the door, observing their faces of disapproval and embarrassment. When the last person left, Chuck turned to find Stephanie in the living room, her $4,000 Versace dress grotesquely contrasting with her expression of fury and humiliation. "Chuck, did you see how they treated me? Like I'm a monster, all because of an employee." Chuck watched her in silence, seeing her completely exposed for the first time. There was no more mask, no more performance. There was the real Stephanie, cruel, arrogant, unable to accept responsibility for her actions. "Stephanie," he said calmly, "you humiliated an exemplary employee in front of respectable people in our society. What exactly did you expect to happen? I expected my husband to defend me, instead of just standing there letting that second-rate social worker interrogate me like I was a criminal." Chuck smiled coldly. "Stephanie, you just called the senator's wife a second-rate social worker, a woman who coordinates support programs for victims of domestic violence. So what? What does that have to do with me?" The question was the last straw. Chuck realized that Stephanie really didn't understand the gravity of what she had done. In her twisted mind, she was the victim of the situation. "Stephanie, tomorrow morning we're going to have a serious conversation. I have some things to show you." "What things?" Chuck walked up the stairs toward the bedroom, stopping only to reply, "Proof." The word echoed through the silent house like a death sentence. Stephanie was left alone in the dining room, surrounded by the remains of a party that had become the greatest shame of her social life. But she didn't yet know that the worst was yet to come. Chuck woke up on Saturday at 6 in the morning with the feeling of a general before the decisive battle. Stephanie was still sleeping, breathing softly with the help of the Xanax she had taken the night before to calm her nerves after the dinner disaster. He dressed silently and went down to his office where he had meticulously prepared all the evidence he had spent weeks collecting. 3 folders organized by Jack Anderson contained the bank statements, expense receipts, and financial analyses. His laptop was connected to a projector with all the humiliation videos organized chronologically. At 8:30, Chuck went up with a tray of coffee and sugar buns that Maria had prepared. Stephanie was awake, sitting in bed, with a resentful expression he knew well. "I brought you breakfast," he said, placing the tray on the side table. "Chuck, about last night," she began. "Let's talk in the office." 15 minutes. The tone of his voice did not allow for discussion. Stephanie watched him leave the bedroom with an expression of growing concern. 15 minutes later, she entered the office in a white silk robe, her hair still tousled from sleep. Chuck was sitting behind his desk, with the 3 organized folders in front of him and the projector screen turned on. "Sit down, Stephanie." She obeyed, noticing for the first time the unusual formality in her husband's voice. "Stephanie, in the last 3 weeks I hired a private detective to investigate your activities. I also installed surveillance equipment in our house." Stephanie's face instantly went pale. "You did what?" "I installed cameras and microphones. I have systematically documented how you treat Maria when I'm not present." Chuck pressed a key on the laptop, and the screen lit up with the first video, Stephanie forcing Maria to clean the same toilet 5 times in a row, screaming at her and humiliating her with each attempt. This isn't," Stephanie stammered. "It's exactly what it looks like." Chuck went to the next video, Stephanie throwing the flower vase on the floor and blaming Maria for the break. "We're going to watch all the evidence together." For the next 30 minutes, Chuck played video after video. Stephanie was forced to watch her own cruelty documented in high definition. Every scream, every humiliation, every moment of psychological sadism was recorded. "Stop," she screamed after the 10th video. "I don't want to see any more of this." "But we're not done yet." Chuck opened the first folder. "Now let's talk about money." He spread the bank statements on the desk. "Maria should be receiving $3,000 a month. How much are you transferring to her?" Stephanie remained silent. $1,500, Chuck answered for her, "for the past 6 months. You're stealing $1,500 a month from a woman who earns less in a year than you spend on a single spa treatment. It's not stealing. It's household economics." "Household economics?" Chuck opened the second folder. "Let's see where that economics went." Stephanie's salon $2,000 a month, personal trainer $1,500, private masseuse $800, aesthetic treatments $2,500. Stephanie tried to stand up, but Chuck continued relentlessly. $6,800 in personal luxuries, paid for with money you diverted from the authorized house expenses. In addition, he opened the third folder, your dinners at the grill declared as employee food, $340 for a dinner at Per Se, recorded as employee expenses. Chuck, let me explain. There is no explanation. His voice was dangerously low. You lied to Maria, telling her it was me who cut her salary due to the crisis. She believes I am responsible for the salary reduction. Stephanie finally collapsed in the chair, tears beginning to roll down her face. But Chuck knew how to distinguish tears of remorse from those of self-pity. Stephanie, you systematically humiliated, stole from and lied to a woman who has worked in our house for 8 years without giving a single reason for complaint. A woman who has 2 kids in school and who depended on you to survive. I didn't know I was being so cruel, sadistic, dishonest. Chuck stood up. Stephanie, you knew exactly what you were doing. I saw the satisfaction on your face in the videos when you humiliated Maria. He walked to the window, watching the city traffic. Last night, you exposed yourself publicly in front of respectable people in our society. Senator Pirelli is considering using our case as an example in a public hearing on abusive working conditions for domestic employees. Stephanie's eyes widened. He can't do that. He can, and he will, unless we take immediate measures to repair the damage. What measures? Chuck turned to look at her. First, you will formally apologize to Maria. Not generic apologies, but specific ones for each abuse committed. Second, you will return all the stolen money with interest. Third, you will sign a document committing never to repeat this behavior. And if I refuse, Chuck smiled coldly, then I will send copies of all these videos and documents to every person who was present at the dinner last night, to the local press, to the Domestic Workers Union, and to the NYPD for the crimes of misappropriation of funds and illegal coercion. The silence that followed was total. Stephanie finally understood there was no escape, no negotiation possible. Maria is waiting in the living room, Chuck said. Let's resolve this now. When they left the office, they found Maria sitting on the cream leather sofa in the living room, her hands trembling slightly. Chuck had explained the situation to her an hour earlier, guaranteeing she was protected no matter what happened. Maria, Chuck said softly, Stephanie has some important things to say to you. Stephanie looked at Chuck with a pleading expression, but found only cold determination in his eyes. And so began the most humiliating confession of Stephanie Miller's life. Maria sat on the edge of the cream leather sofa in the living room, her hands carefully clasped in her lap. Her eyes moved nervously between Chuck and Stephanie, still not fully understanding why she had been called to this formal conversation. Stephanie stood in the center of the room, her silk robe seeming inappropriate for the solemnity of the moment. Chuck stood by the marble fireplace, observing every nuance of his wife's expression. Stephanie, he said calmly, start. There was a long silence. Stephanie looked at Maria, then at Chuck, clearly looking for a way to minimize her confessions. But the implacable expression on her husband's face made it clear there would be no half-truths. Maria, she began, her voice trembling slightly, I need to apologize for my behavior. Be specific, Chuck interrupted. Stephanie took a deep breath. I apologize for screaming at you. Stephanie, Chuck's voice cut the air like a knife. We'll stay here all day if we have to. Start with what happened last Monday with the towels. Stephanie closed her eyes, realizing there was no escape. Maria, on Monday I asked you to refold the bathroom towels, even though I knew they were perfectly folded. I messed them up on purpose to humiliate you. Maria's eyes widened, finally realizing that Chuck knew everything. Continue, Chuck said. On Tuesday, I deliberately spilled sugar on the kitchen floor and forced you to clean it with your hands, claiming the vacuum cleaner made too much noise. Stephanie's voice was getting lower with each confession. On Wednesday, she hesitated, knowing the next confession would be the worst of all. On Wednesday, Chuck finished impatiently, you threw the flower vase on the floor and blamed Maria for the break. I did, Stephanie whispered. And I forced you to clean the pieces with your bare hands. Maria's hands went to her lips, the scars from the cut still visible on her fingertips. There's more, Chuck continued. Tell her about the money. This was the most difficult confession. Stephanie sat heavily in the armchair across from Maria, unable to make eye contact. Maria, 6 months ago, I started paying you only $1,500 a month instead of the $3,000 that Chuck authorized. The employee frowned, confused, but the lady said Mr. Miller had ordered the salary cut because of the company's crisis. I lied. The admission came out as a whimper. Chuck never ordered any cuts. I made up that story to justify why I was paying you less. Where did the money go? Chuck asked, although he already knew the answer. I used it for my beauty treatments. Hair salon, personal trainer, massages. Maria got up abruptly, her legs trembling with rage. The lady used my salary money to go to the hair salon, Maria, please, let me explain. Explain what? The employee's voice, normally low and respectful, was charged with contained fury. The lady made me believe I wasn't worth even half my salary. I cut expenses. I took my kids out of extracurricular activities. I went without. Also, the lady could get her nails done. Chuck watched Maria transform before his eyes. For years, she had been forced into silence by economic necessity. Now, finally protected, her true personality emerged. Maria is right to be furious, Chuck said. Stephanie, how much money did you divert in total? I don't know exactly. I do. Chuck took a calculator from the coffee table. $1,500 a month for 6 months. $9,000 stolen from the salary, plus approximately $3,000 in personal expenses, falsely declared as hers. Total, $12,000. The figure echoed through the living room like a sentence. Maria, Chuck continued, in addition to the stolen money, Stephanie owes you compensation for the psychological damage and coercion you suffered. I consider another $3,000 fair. Chuck, you can't just... Stephanie protested. $15,000, he interrupted her. It's the least Maria deserves after months of humiliation and theft. Chuck went to the built-in safe behind a painting. He took out an envelope with money he had prepared the day before and handed it to Maria. Here are the $15,000. And one more thing. He returned to the safe and took out another envelope. Maria, I want to offer you a position in my company. Administrative Operations Supervisor, starting salary of $5,000 with health insurance, a food bonus, and opportunity for growth. Maria looked at the money in her hands, then at Chuck, then at Stephanie. For a few seconds it looked like she was going to faint. Mr. Miller, I don't know what to say. Say yes, you're an intelligent, organized, and trustworthy woman. Qualities that are rare and valuable in the business world, but I only have a high school education, and I'll pay for a technical course in administration for you. If you're interested, you can even go to college later. Maria began to cry, not tears of humiliation, but of relief and hope. For the first time in months, she saw a future beyond the kitchen of that house. Stephanie, Chuck turned to his wife, you're going to move into an apartment temporarily. You need time to reflect on your actions and go to psychological therapy. Chuck, you can't kick me out of my own home. I'm not kicking you out. I'm giving you the opportunity to become a better person. If you can prove you've truly changed, we can rebuild our marriage. Otherwise, he didn't need to finish the sentence. Stephanie understood that her world had completely fallen apart. Maria, Chuck said softly, do you want to work your last day here today, or would you prefer to start at the company on Monday? Can I start on Monday? She asked timidly. Of course. Martha, my secretary, will guide you through everything. Maria got up, still holding the envelopes with money. Mr. Miller, thank you very much, and to Mrs. Stephanie. She looked at Stephanie for a long moment. I hope the lady finds help. And she left the room with more dignity than she had been allowed to show in months. Stephanie remained seated in the armchair, finally understanding the magnitude of what she had lost. Not just money or social status, but her own soul. Chuck watched her in silence, wondering if it would be possible for her to find her way back to humanity. Only time would tell. Upwards. The continuation of the story follows in the next text block. 3 months have passed since the confrontation that forever changed the dynamics of the Miller family. Chuck had rented a duplex apartment in Greenwich Village for Stephanie, elegant but far from the luxury of the Los Feliz mansion. The 2,000-square-foot apartment had views of Washington Square Park and was furnished with modern and functional pieces. Stephanie, accustomed to the 4,000-square-foot mansion with antique furniture and artworks, felt like a refugee in a foreign land. Twice a week, on Tuesdays and Thursdays, she walked 3 blocks to the office of Dr. Alice Stone, a psychologist specializing in personality disorders. The medical office building on Fifth Avenue didn't have the glamour of the spas she used to frequent, but Stephanie had learned she had no choice. Stephanie, how did you feel when you forced Maria to clean the pieces of the vase you had deliberately broken? Dr. Stone always asked the most difficult questions in the same calm and professional voice. I felt powerful, Stephanie admitted after a long silence, her hands trembling slightly, like I finally had control over something. Control over what? My life, my marriage, my house. The psychologist jotted something down in her notepad. At 50, Dr. Stone had seen hundreds of cases of psychological abuse and knew that true change only came through understanding the roots of the behavior. Stephanie, do you remember when you started to feel out of control over your own life? The question hit Stephanie like a punch to the stomach. She closed her eyes, her mind returning to places she had locked away years ago. "When Chuck started to become successful," she whispered. "In the first years of our marriage, we were partners. I helped with the company, gave my opinion on business, participated in decisions. But when he started to grow, I was left behind." "What do you mean you were left behind?" "He didn't need me for anything anymore. The company grew. He hired secretaries, consultants, directors. I became just the pretty wife who showed up at social events." The tears began to roll, but this time they were different from the tears of self-pity she cried at home. They were tears of recognition. "Stephanie, did you look for other ways to feel useful or fulfilled?" "I tried. I took courses in interior design, art, gourmet cooking. I participated in charity committees, but nothing seemed to matter. Chuck always came home talking about business I didn't understand, people I didn't know, problems I couldn't help solve." "And when did you start to mistreat Maria?" Stephanie hesitated. "About a year ago. At first I just demanded more. I asked her to redo things that were already well done. But when I saw that she obeyed without questioning, when I saw that I had absolute power over someone." "You became addicted to that feeling of power." "Yes." The admission was almost inaudible. "It was the only area of my life where I felt important, where someone respected me." "Stephanie, Maria didn't respect you. She feared you. I know now. But at the time, it was better than being ignored." While Stephanie was battling her inner demons in Dr. Stone's office, Maria was undergoing a completely opposite transformation at Chuck's office. The company, Miller and Associates, occupied 3 floors of a commercial building in Midtown. Maria had been introduced to the team as the new administrative operations supervisor, responsible for coordinating office logistics, managing suppliers, and supervising the support staff. On her first day, she arrived at 7:30 in the morning, half an hour before the scheduled time, wearing a navy blue skirt and jacket set that Chuck had insisted on buying for her. Martha, the executive secretary, greeted her with a genuine smile. "Maria, it's so good to meet you in person. Chuck has said such great things about you." "Thank you, Mrs. Martha. I hope I can live up to his trust." "I'm sure you will." "Shall we start with a tour of the facilities?" During the first few weeks, Maria absorbed information like a sponge. She learned about management systems, communication protocols, quality control. Her experience in keeping a house running perfectly translated naturally to keeping an office operating efficiently. "Maria, you reorganized the entire filing system in 1 week," said Tom John at the company's accountant. "We had been trying to find documents from 2021 for months. It's just a matter of systematic organization," she replied modestly. "At home, if you don't keep everything in its right place, it becomes chaos." Chuck watched her transformation with growing admiration. Maria not only performed her tasks perfectly, but she began to identify problems that no one had noticed and propose creative solutions. "Mr. Miller," she said during a weekly meeting, "I've noticed that we're spending a lot on office suppliers because each department places separate orders. If we centralize the purchases, we can negotiate better prices. How much do you calculate we could save?" "At least 30% on material costs." Chuck smiled. The same woman Stephanie considered just an employee was identifying savings opportunities that his executives with MBAs hadn't perceived. At night, Maria returned to her simple house in Queens, but now with a completely different perspective. Her kids, Leo, 16, and Anna, 14, noticed the change immediately. "Mom, you look different," Anna commented during dinner. "More happy." "I am happy, honey. I finally have a job where I'm respected." "What about the evil boss?" Leo asked. "Don't talk about her like that, son. Everyone deserves a chance to change." But Maria didn't know if Stephanie was truly changing, and Chuck wasn't sure either, until the night everything became clear. 6 months after the temporary separation, Chuck finally agreed to meet Stephanie for dinner, not at home but at The Grill, the sophisticated restaurant in Midtown where she used to have lunch with her friends back in the days when she used the money stolen from Maria to pay for her extravagances. Chuck arrived at 8 o'clock sharp, in a discreet black suit. He found Stephanie already seated at a reserved table in the corner of the restaurant, away from curious glances. She was wearing a simple navy blue dress, a piece that cost 1/10 of the designer dresses she used to wear. "You look different," was the first thing he said as he sat down. "Different? How?" "More serene, less theatrical." Stephanie smiled sadly. 6 months of intensive therapy will do that to a person. The waiter approached and Chuck ordered a bottle of red wine, nothing too expensive or ostentatious. Stephanie chose only water. "How is Maria?" she asked, and Chuck noticed there was no resentment in her voice. "Exceptional. She was promoted to operations coordinator. She's taking a technical course in administration at night and has gotten the best grades in the class. I'm happy for her." Chuck studied Stephanie's expression, looking for signs of sarcasm or falseness. He found none. "Stephanie, why did you really call me for this dinner?" She took a deep breath before answering. "Because I need to tell you what I've discovered about myself, and because I want to know if there's still any possibility for us. Talk." "Chuck, I spent months trying to understand why I became so cruel to Maria. Dr. Stone made me see things about myself that I had never admitted." Stephanie paused to take a sip of water, her hands trembling slightly. "I married you because you made me feel special. In the first years when the company was just starting, I felt like your partner. You asked for my opinion. I helped with important decisions. I felt necessary. You were always necessary." "No, Chuck, let me finish." Her voice was firm, but not aggressive. "When you started to become successful, when the company grew and you no longer needed my support, I started to feel useless, an expensive decoration in an expensive house." Chuck leaned forward, paying full attention. "Over time, I lost my identity. I was no longer Stephanie Santos, the woman who had her own opinions and dreams. I was just Stephanie Miller, the successful businessman's wife. Why did you never tell me this? Because I was afraid you would see me as a burden, as someone who was hindering your success." Chuck felt a lump in his throat. "Stephanie, then I started looking for places where I still had power, and I found it in my relationship with Maria. She depended on me financially. She couldn't question me. She couldn't leave me. It was the only place where I felt superior to someone." The confession was painful to hear, but Chuck recognized its authenticity. "Humiliating Maria gave me a temporary feeling of control. When I screamed at her, when I forced her to redo perfect jobs, I felt powerful. It was pathetic, but it was the only source of self-esteem I had. And now? Now I'm learning to build real self-esteem. I started doing volunteer work at the Women's Network NGO, helping vulnerable women. Ironically, working with victims of abuse made me understand the damage I caused." Chuck watched Stephanie talk about her volunteer work. There was a genuine passion in her voice he hadn't seen in years. "Chuck, I met women who suffered psychological abuse, much worse than what I did to Maria, and I saw how that kind of trauma can completely destroy a person's self-esteem. I hated myself for having done that to someone. And the therapy, Dr. Stone helped me understand that my behavior came from a deep insecurity, disguised as superiority. I felt so small in my own life that I needed to make someone else smaller to feel big." The dinner arrived, but neither of them had much appetite. "Stephanie, you said you want to know if there's still a possibility for us. What exactly are you asking? If you can forgive me, if you can trust me again, if you believe I've truly changed." Chuck cut a piece of salmon and chewed slowly, thinking, "Stephanie, you did something unforgivable to a vulnerable person. Not only did you psychologically humiliate her, but you financially stole from her." "I know. But," he continued, "I see a different person in you from the woman I discovered 6 months ago. The question is this change permanent or is it just temporary guilt? How can I prove it's permanent?" Chuck put his fork on the plate. "Stephanie, there are some conditions if we want to try to rebuild our marriage." "What are they?" "First, you continue with individual therapy indefinitely. Second, we do couples therapy. Third, total financial transparency. You don't spend a penny without my prior approval. Fourth, if I see the slightest sign that you've returned to your old patterns, this is over for good." Stephanie nodded in silence. "And there's one more thing," Chuck continued. "You're going to apologize in person to all the guests from that dinner night. You're going to take full responsibility for what you made them witness." This was the most difficult condition. Stephanie knew it meant public humiliation, an admission of guilt to important people in New York society, even knowing it could destroy our social reputation. "Stephanie, our social reputation is already destroyed. The only thing that can save it is total honesty and genuine repentance." She reflected for a few minutes. "Chuck, I accept all the conditions, but I have one question for you." "What?" "Can you truly forgive me? Or will you hold it over me for the rest of my life?" Chuck looked into Stephanie's eyes and saw, for the first time in years, the woman he had fallen in love with 20 years ago. Not the perfect social mask, but the real person underneath all the insecurity and cruelty. Stephanie, if you prove you've truly changed, I can forgive, but trust will have to be rebuilt brick by brick. I understand. Chuck signaled for the waiter to bring the check. Stephanie, there's one more thing you need to know. What? Maria asked me if she could write you a letter. Stephanie's eyes widened. A letter? She said her therapy is also helping her process what happened, and that there are some things she wants to tell you. What did you say to her? That the decision was yours. Stephanie was silent for a long moment. Chuck, I'd like to read the letter, and, if she agrees, I'd like to meet with her. Are you sure? I need to look her in the eyes and truly ask for forgiveness, not because you're forcing me, but because it's the right thing to do. Chuck smiled for the first time that night. I'll talk to Maria. When they left the restaurant, they walked silently to their cars. Before saying goodbye, Stephanie touched Chuck's arm. Chuck, thank you for not completely giving up on me. Stephanie, everyone deserves a second chance. But only one. They parted that night knowing that the future of their marriage would depend on the actions of the next few months. Stephanie had passed the first test, but the biggest challenge was yet to come. 2 weeks after the dinner at the grill, Maria handed a sealed letter to Chuck. The simple white envelope contained 3 handwritten pages, with the careful penmanship of someone who had chosen every word with precision. Chuck handed it to Stephanie that same night at the Greenwich Village apartment. She opened it with trembling hands and read it in silence, tears rolling down her face with each paragraph. The letter began formally, Mrs. Stephanie, but then evolved into deep reflections on forgiveness, personal growth, and second chances. Maria wrote about her own therapy sessions, funded by Chuck's company's health insurance, and how she was learning to process the trauma without holding on to hatred. Mrs. Stephanie, a particularly moving excerpt, read, I've learned that holding a grudge is like drinking poison and waiting for the other person to die. I don't want to carry this bitterness for the rest of my life. If the lady has truly changed, as Mr. Miller says she has, then maybe we can meet. Not to forget what happened, but so we can both move on. The letter ended with an invitation. If the lady would like to see me, I can receive her at my new office at the company, at whatever time is best for you. Stephanie called Chuck that same night. Chuck, I want to meet with Maria tomorrow. Are you sure? She doesn't owe you anything. If it's not a genuine apology, it will be genuine. I promise you. The next afternoon, Stephanie entered the Miller and Associates building for the first time. Martha greeted her politely and took her to the 3rd floor, where Maria had her own office, a small office, but with a view of Times Square. Maria was sitting behind a light wooden desk, in a grey skirt and jacket set and reading glasses. Papers were organized in precise piles, a modern computer, and a photo of her 2 kids on the corner of the desk. She stood up when Stephanie entered. Mrs. Stephanie. Maria. For a few seconds, the 2 women looked at each other in silence. Stephanie saw a transformed Maria, more self-assured, more elegant, radiating a dignity she had never been allowed to show. Maria saw a different Stephanie, more humble, without the arrogance she used to wear as armor. Please, have a seat. Maria gestured to a chair in front of the desk. Stephanie sat down, noticing that it was now she who was in the position of visitor, while Maria occupied the position of authority behind the desk. The irony was not lost on her. Maria, first I want to thank you for agreeing to see me. Mrs. Stephanie, I'm going to be direct. I didn't agree to this meeting out of kindness, or because I have automatically forgiven you. I agreed because my therapist said it could be important for my healing process. The brutal honesty of the response hit Stephanie like a slap, but she knew she deserved it. Maria, I came here to ask for your forgiveness, not a generic apology, but a specific one for what I did to you. Maria leaned back in her chair, crossed her arms, and waited. For months, I systematically humiliated you. I screamed at you for non-existent mistakes. I forced you to redo perfect jobs just to show power over you. I made you clean up messes I had made myself on purpose. Stephanie paused, her voice breaking. I forced you to clean up pieces of glass with your bare hands. I saw you bleed and felt pleasure from your pain. I stole half of your salary for 6 months to fund my personal luxuries. I lied to you by telling you my husband had ordered the salary cut. Maria kept a neutral expression, but her hands were clenched on the table. Worse than all that, I made you believe you weren't worth even half your own value. I made you feel you deserved to be treated like garbage. And I did it because I felt insignificant in my own life and needed to make you smaller to feel big. Stephanie's tears were now falling freely. Maria, there is no excuse for what I did. There is no explanation that justifies my cruelty. I abused the power I had over you, in a cowardly and pathetic way. Maria remained silent for a long moment. "Mrs. Stephanie, may I ask you some questions?" "Of course. When the lady forced me to clean those pieces of glass, what did you feel when you saw me bleeding?" The question was like a stab. Stephanie closed her eyes, forcing herself to remember and be honest. "I felt satisfaction, as if someone was finally suffering more than I was. And when you used my money to go to the hair salon, did you think about me?" "Yes. I thought you would never know, that you were too stupid to find out that I deserved that money more than you did." "Why?" Because I believed that people like me were naturally superior to people like you." The admission was painful, but necessary. Maria stood up and walked to the window, watching the traffic on the street. "Mrs. Stephanie, do you know what the most painful part of all this was?" "What?" "It wasn't the screaming or the humiliation. It was when I got home and had to tell my kids that I couldn't pay for their extracurricular activities anymore because my boss had cut my salary. I saw the disappointment in their eyes, and I felt like a failure as a mother." Stephanie covered her face with her hands, sobbing. "My son Leo wanted to take a computer course. My daughter Anna dreamed of learning English. I had to say no to my children's dreams because the lady wanted to get her nails done." The silence that followed was devastating. "Maria, how can I repair this? How can I undo the wrong I caused?" Maria returned to her chair and looked directly into Stephanie's eyes. "Mrs. Stephanie, you can't undo it. The wrong has already been done. But you can do things differently from now on." "How?" "First, never again treat anyone the way you treated me. Second, use your privileged position to help other people instead of humiliating them. Third, tell your story to other people so they can learn from your mistakes." Stephanie nodded vigorously. "And there's one more thing," Maria continued. "I want you to know that I forgive you." Stephanie's eyes widened, surprised. "I don't forgive you because you deserve it, but because I need to forgive to move on. Holding hatred would only hurt me more." "Maria, but forgiving doesn't mean forgetting. It also doesn't mean I trust the lady again. Trust is something that is rebuilt with actions, not with words." Stephanie stood up, extending her hand. "Maria, thank you for the forgiveness, and thank you for showing me what true dignity means." Maria shook her hand firmly. "Mrs. Stephanie, I sincerely hope you find a way to be happy without needing to make others unhappy." When Stephanie left the building, she walked to her car in silence. She sat behind the wheel for a few minutes, processing the encounter. For the first time in months, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years: self-respect. Not the artificial respect that came from humiliating others, but the real respect that comes from facing one's own mistakes and trying to correct them. It was a start. 8 months after the confrontation that had changed their lives, Chuck and Stephanie sat in the office of Dr. Elizabeth Harris, a couples therapist, for their 12th session. The elegant office in the Upper East Side had light blue walls, natural plants, and an atmosphere of serenity that contrasted with the tension of the first sessions. "How do you feel about the progress of the last few weeks, Doctor?" Harris asked, observing the couple seated in separate armchairs. Chuck and Stephanie exchanged a look before answering. It was a different look from the ones they had exchanged months ago, less defensive, more respectful. "I feel like we're building something new," Chuck said. "Not trying to go back to what we were, but creating a relationship based on who we've become." "Stephanie, I'm learning to know myself as an individual before trying to be a wife again," she replied. "For a long time, I defined my identity through Chuck's social position. Now I'm discovering who I am when I don't need to impress anyone." Dr. Harris made some notes. "Stephanie, tell me about your work at the NGO." Stephanie's face lit up, a transformation Chuck was still getting used to seeing. "This week I helped Mary, a 40-year-old woman who suffered psychological abuse from her ex-husband for 15 years. When I told her my own story, how I had treated Maria, she realized she wasn't alone, that even privileged people can be cruel when they feel vulnerable. And how did that make you feel? Useful, genuinely useful. Not because I was controlling someone, but because I was helping someone to free themselves from control." Chuck watched Stephanie talk about her volunteer work. In recent months, she had become one of the most dedicated volunteers at the Women's Network, using her personal experience to help other women identify patterns of abuse. "Chuck," Dr. Harris turned to him, "how are you handling Stephanie's change?" "It's terrifying," he admitted. "On the one hand, I see the woman I fell in love with 20 years ago. On the other, I'm afraid it's temporary. That at the first moment of stress, she'll return to her old patterns." "That fear is understandable," the therapist said. "Stephanie, How do you respond to Chuck's concern? I understand him perfectly, Stephanie replied without offense. If I were him, I'd be afraid too. The only thing I can do is continue to prove day after day that the change is real. And how do you plan to do that? By continuing individual therapy, being transparent about my feelings and insecurities, and never again using power over others to feel better about myself. Dr. Harris leaned back in her chair. You both talked about rebuilding trust. What concrete steps are you taking? Chuck answered first. Stephanie has limited access to the house finances and has to account for all expenses. It's not a punishment. It's a precaution until trust is fully restored. And you, Stephanie, how do you feel about these limitations? Relieved, actually. For years, I used money as a way to compensate for emotional frustrations. Having limits forces me to deal with feelings in a healthier way. Speaking of Maria, Dr. Harris consulted her notes. How is your relationship with her now? Maria was promoted again, Chuck said proudly. She's now a regional manager and is studying administration at Columbia University. She has become one of the most valuable employees in the company. And you, Stephanie? How do you feel about her success? Proud, Stephanie replied without hesitation. Genuinely proud. Seeing Maria prosper makes me realize how much potential I tried to suppress in her. It's a daily lesson on how our actions can elevate or destroy other people. The session continued for another 40 minutes, addressing issues of intimacy, communication, and future planning. When they left the office, Chuck and Stephanie walked together to the parking garage. Stephanie, can I ask you a personal question? Of course. When did you really decide to change? When did you stop just feeling sorry for yourself and start working to be different? Stephanie stopped next to her car, reflecting. It was when I read Maria's letter, when I realized she was offering me a forgiveness I didn't deserve. In that moment, I understood that I had two choices: waste that generosity by continuing to be a horrible person, or honor it by becoming someone worthy of that forgiveness. And now, how do you see yourself? As someone under construction. I'm no longer the cruel woman who humiliated Maria, but I'm not yet the woman I want to be either. I'm on the way. Chuck nodded. Stephanie, I want to tell you something. What? For the first time in years, when I look at you, I see the real person. Not the social performance, not the perfect wife mask. I see Stephanie. She smiled, a genuine smile without artifice. Chuck, can I ask you a question too? Of course. Can you love me again? Not for who I was or who you want me to be, but for who I'm becoming. Chuck looked into Stephanie's eyes and saw courage, vulnerability, and a genuine determination to be better. Stephanie, I never stopped loving you. I just stopped trusting you. And the trust is coming back. They parted that afternoon knowing there was still work to be done, therapy sessions to attend, forgiveness to be earned, and trust to be rebuilt. But for the first time in months, they both believed it was possible. The journey back to each other was just beginning, but the first steps had been taken with sincerity and hope. The continuation of the story follows in the next text block. A year and a half after the discovery that nearly destroyed their marriage, Chuck Miller woke up on a sunny October morning with a feeling he hadn't experienced in a long time, genuine hope for the future. Stephanie was sleeping beside him. They had returned to sharing the same bedroom 3 months ago, but they still slept in separate beds. It was slow, but solid progress. As Dr. Harris, the couple's therapist, used to say, trust is like a broken vase. You can glue the pieces back together, but you'll always see the cracks. The beauty is in accepting the marks and building something new on them. Chuck quietly got up and walked to the window that overlooked the Hollywood Hills. The mansion in Los Feliz was different now. Stephanie had insisted on redecorating it, removing all the ostentatious elements she used to impress visitors. Instead of the antique furniture and expensive artworks, she had chosen comfortable and cozy pieces. It's a house for living, not for showing off, she had explained to Chuck. The physical transformation of the house reflected the emotional transformation of its inhabitants. There were no more domestic employees. Stephanie had insisted on taking care of the house herself as a way of staying connected to the reality of the work she once despised. Good morning. Stephanie's soft voice pulled him from his thoughts. Good morning. Did you sleep well? Yes. And you? Are you nervous? Chuck smiled. Today was the day they had chosen to renew their marriage vows. Not a pompous ceremony to impress New York society, but an intimate celebration with only the people who truly mattered. A little nervous, yes, but in the right way. Stephanie approached the window, maintaining a respectful distance. In recent months, they had relearned how to touch physically. First formal handshakes, then cautious hugs, and more recently, soft caresses that demanded nothing more than connection. "Chuck, can I ask you a question before the ceremony?" "Of course. Why did you decide to give me a second chance?" "Truly, not the diplomatic answer you give in therapy." Chuck reflected for a moment. "Because I saw you fight to change. Not because I was pressuring you, but because you genuinely wanted to be a better person. And because I realized that I also needed to change." "How so?" "Stephanie, for years I neglected you emotionally. It doesn't justify what you did to Maria, but I created an environment where you felt invisible. A more attentive husband might have perceived your pain before it transformed into cruelty." The admission took Stephanie by surprise. Throughout the therapy process, Chuck had focused on her mistakes, rarely acknowledging his own flaws. "Chuck, you're not responsible for my choices." "I'm not responsible, but I may have contributed to your emotional state. From now on, I want to be the kind of husband who sees his wife as a partner, not as a decoration." At 11, they left for a small church in downtown Los Angeles that Stephanie had chosen for the atmosphere of serenity. The guests were few, but significant. Jack Anderson, the private detective who had helped uncover the truth, was present with his wife. Dr. Stone, Stephanie's psychologist, had accepted the invitation. Martha, Chuck's executive secretary, represented the company. And in the first pew, in an elegant navy blue dress, was Maria with her 2 kids, Leo and Anna. Her presence at the ceremony had been Stephanie's suggestion, enthusiastically approved by Chuck. "If we're going to renew our vows based on truth and forgiveness," Stephanie had argued, "Maria must be present. She's part of our story now." The priest, a young and charismatic man named Father Deaton Michael, had known the couple's entire story through the counseling sessions prior to the ceremony. He began with a reflection on second chances. "We are here today not to celebrate a perfect marriage," he said, "but to celebrate the power of human transformation. Chuck and Stephanie are not the same people who got married 15 years ago. They are people who faced their flaws, fought their demons, and chose to build something new on the ruins of what was destroyed." Chuck looked at Stephanie, who was beautiful in a simple white dress she had chosen herself, without brands, without ostentation, just elegant. Her hair was in a low bun, and she was only wearing her original wedding ring. "Chuck," Father Michael addressed him, "do you choose Stephanie as your wife, knowing her flaws and imperfections, committing to love her not for who she was, but for who she is becoming?" "Yes, Father. I choose Stephanie knowing that we are both works in progress. I promise to be the partner she deserves and the man I want to be." "Stephanie, do you choose Chuck as your husband, committing to honor not only him, but all those whom your future actions may affect?" "Yes, Father. I choose Chuck, and I promise that I will never again use power over others to hide my own insecurities. I promise to be a woman worthy of the forgiveness I received." When they exchanged the rings, the same ones from 15 years ago, but now loaded with a renewed meaning, there were tears in the eyes of everyone present. Maria cried silently in the first pew, holding her kids' hands. Seeing the woman who had humiliated her publicly commit to being better was more powerful than any apology. After the ceremony, the guests gathered in the chapel garden for a simple lunch. Chuck watched Stephanie talking with Maria and her kids, asking about their studies, genuinely interested in their lives. "Anna wants to study law," Maria was saying, "and Leo got a scholarship to study engineering at Stanford." "How wonderful," Stephanie exclaimed. "If they need help with their studies, I have contacts in the legal field." It was a sincere offer without condescension. Chuck noticed how Maria responded naturally, no longer as an employee talking to a boss, but as one woman talking to another. "Mrs. Stephanie," Anna, Maria's daughter, approached timidly. "Can I ask you a question?" "Of course, honey." "How did you know you needed to change?" The childlike question hit the essence of the entire journey. Stephanie knelt down to be at the 16-year-old girl's level. "Anna, I realized that I was hurting people to feel better, and I understood that a person who needs to make others smaller to feel big is actually feeling very small inside." "And now do you feel big?" Stephanie smiled. "Now I feel the right size, neither small nor big, just human." At the end of the afternoon, when the guests left, Chuck and Stephanie stayed alone in the chapel garden, watching the sunset over Los Angeles. "Stephanie, how do you feel?" "Hopeful. For the first time in years, I wake up knowing that I can look at myself in the mirror and respect the person I see." Chuck took her hand, a gesture that had become natural again. "Stephanie, I want to make you one more promise beyond today's vows." "What?" "I promise to never again let us grow apart emotionally. If you're hurting, I want you to tell me. If I'm neglecting you, remind me. Let's be true partners this time. And I promise to never again take out my frustrations on vulnerable people. If I feel insignificant, I'll look for constructive ways to find a purpose." They remained in silence for a few minutes, holding hands, watching the city light up with the night lights. "Chuck, do you think we'll make it?" "I think we already have. The hard part isn't having a perfect marriage, Stephanie. It's having an honest marriage." When they drove down the hill toward home, they both knew that the future still held challenges. There would be moments of tension, emotional relapses, a continuous job of rebuilding, but for the first time in years, they would face those challenges together, as partners who consciously chose to build something new on the ashes of what was destroyed. The renewal of vows was not the end of the story. It was just the beginning of a new story, written by people who had learned that true love doesn't ignore flaws, but transforms them into starting points for something better. 2 years after the vow renewal, Chuck Miller and Stephanie sat in the auditorium of Columbia University, applauding enthusiastically as Maria Santos walked across the stage to receive her bachelor's degree in administration, summa cum laude, the highest academic distinction. Maria wore a black gown over a navy blue dress, her smile radiant as she held the tube that represented 4 years of nighttime study after long days of work. Her kids, Leo and Anna, screamed with joy from the front rows. "She did it," Stephanie whispered to Chuck, her tears of genuine pride contrasting with the tears of rage she had shed years ago over the same woman. "She was always capable. She just needed a chance," Chuck replied, applauding vigorously. After the ceremony, they met in the university courtyard. Maria was radiant, surrounded by her family and classmates. When she saw Chuck and Stephanie approach, her smile widened. "Mr. Miller, Mrs. Stephanie, thank you for coming." "We wouldn't miss it for anything," Chuck said, hugging her warmly. "I'm so proud of you, Maria, and not just as an employer, but as a friend." Stephanie approached and, for the first time in all these years, hugged Maria spontaneously. "Maria, you are an inspiration. Seeing your determination helped me find the courage to change my own life." "Mrs. Stephanie, we both changed. The difference is that I needed opportunities that the lady gave me. The lady needed the courage she found within herself." Leo, now 18 and studying engineering at Stanford, approached the group. "Mr. Miller, I want to thank you for what you did for our family, for giving my mom a chance and believing in her potential. Leo, your mother always had that potential. I just removed the obstacles that prevented her from showing it." Anna, now 16 and president of her school's student association, looked at Stephanie with admiration. "Mrs. Stephanie, are you going to continue with the work at the NGO?" "Of course. In fact, I'm expanding the project. We're going to create a specific program for domestic employees who want to go back to school. It will be called the Maria Project." Maria's eyes widened, emotional. "Mrs. Stephanie, that wasn't necessary." "Yes, it was. Maria, your story showed that intelligence and competence don't depend on social position. How many other women are out there, cleaning houses, taking care of other people's kids, with dreams kept on hold because they never had a chance?" Chuck watched Stephanie talk passionately about the social project. She was the same woman who years ago humiliated Maria to feel superior. Now she was using her privileged position to elevate other people. What transformation teaches, he thought, is that our worst flaws can become our greatest strengths when faced with honesty. 3 months later, Chuck was in his office when Martha, his secretary, knocked on the door. "Mr. Miller, you have a call. It's from Senator Anthony Pirelli." Chuck answered with curiosity. He hadn't spoken with the senator since that uncomfortable dinner night, more than 2 years ago. "Chuck, I hope you're doing well. I'm calling to make you an unusual invitation." "Yes, Senator. We're organizing a public hearing in the state Senate on the working conditions of domestic employees. I'd like you and Stephanie to testify." Chuck almost dropped the phone. "Testify? Chuck, that night at your house was disturbing, but what we learned afterward was inspiring. Stephanie's transformation, the support you gave Maria, the social project she's developing. That's an example of how negative situations can generate positive change. Senator, do you want us to publicly expose our story? I want you to share the lessons learned. How many employers mistreat their domestic employees? How many people use power to humiliate others? Your story shows that it's possible to change." Chuck promised to talk to Stephanie and give him an answer in a few days. That night during dinner, which they now always prepared themselves without employees, Chuck told her about the invitation. "What do you think?" he asked. Stephanie reflected as she cut the salmon she had prepared. Chuck, for 2 years, I've been telling the women at the NGO the importance of facing the truth about ourselves. It would be hypocritical for me to refuse to publicly expose my own journey. But it will be embarrassing. All of New York will know the details. So what? Stephanie interrupted him. If our public humiliation can prevent other Marias from being mistreated, it's worth it. A week later, the state Senate was full for the hearing on dignity in domestic work, rights, duties, and social transformation. Chuck and Stephanie were at the main table, along with Maria, Senator Pirelli, and representatives from the Domestic Workers Union. Chuck wore a sober suit, Stephanie a simple and elegant outfit. Ladies and gentlemen, senators, Stephanie began her speech, her voice firm and clear. My name is Stephanie Miller, and I am here to confess that I was an abusive employer. A murmur ran through the chamber. For months I psychologically humiliated my domestic employee. I screamed at her for non-existent mistakes. I forced her to redo perfect jobs, and I stole half of her salary to fund my personal luxuries. Stephanie paused, looking directly at the television cameras broadcasting the hearing live. I did this because I felt insignificant in my own life and needed to make someone else smaller to feel important. It was cowardly, cruel, and unacceptable. Over the next 20 minutes, Stephanie systematically detailed her abuses without minimizing or seeking excuses. She talked about therapy, the process of change, the work at the NGO. My story is not about redemption, she concluded. It's about responsibility. Every person in a position of power, whether an employer, a boss, or simply someone with more resources, has the choice to elevate or humiliate those who depend on them. I chose to humiliate, but I have learned to choose to elevate. When Chuck gave his speech, he focused on the responsibility of employers to create dignified work environments. Maria was always an exemplary employee, he said. The problem wasn't her competence, but my negligence in not protecting her from the psychological abuse in my own home. The most impactful speech was Maria's. Senators, I am not here as a victim, but as a survivor. What I went through was painful, but it taught me that our dignity doesn't come from how others treat us, but from how we allow ourselves to be treated. She spoke about the importance of education, self-esteem, and union organization. No domestic employee should have to accept humiliation out of fear of losing their job. But for this to change, we need stricter laws, effective oversight, and above all, a cultural shift that sees domestic work as a dignified profession, not as servitude. When the hearing ended, Chuck, Stephanie, and Maria left the Senate building together. The journalists approached, but they only confirmed that they would continue working for concrete social changes. Maria, Stephanie said as they walked to the cars, thank you for agreeing to do this with us. Mrs. Stephanie, it was necessary. Our story must be told so that other similar stories can be avoided. Chuck watched the two women talking and realized something profound. They were no longer boss and employee or tormentor and victim. They were two women who had faced the consequences of bad decisions together and built something better on the rubble. That night, watching the local news, Chuck and Stephanie saw excerpts from their testimonies. The anchor commented, "A story of abuse that transformed into an example of redemption and social change." "Chuck," Stephanie said, taking his hand, "do you regret exposing our story?" "No." "Do you?" "Never." Maria was right. Our story had to be told. Chuck smiled, remembering the therapist's words about broken vases and rebuilding. They had broken their marriage, deeply hurt an innocent person, but they managed to transform the destruction into an opportunity for growth. "Stephanie, what do you think is the main lesson from our whole story?" "That it's never too late to change, that people can genuinely transform, and that sometimes our worst actions can become our greatest lessons." Chuck nodded, looking out the window at the city of Los Angeles. Somewhere in the city, Maria was at home with her kids, planning the future as a Bachelor of Administration. Somewhere else, the women at Stephanie's NGO were finding the strength to leave abusive relationships. And there, in that room, a couple who had almost destroyed everything was building something new, better, more honest. The legacy of the transformation was not only in individual change, but in the ability to use that change to positively impact the lives of others. It was more than Chuck had dreamed possible that Thursday in March, when he got home early and discovered who his wife really was. Now, 2 years later, he knew who he had chosen to become, and that made all the difference. Samistulfurunter Epilogue, True Value. 5 years after the discovery that transformed their lives, Chuck Miller walked through the halls of the new headquarters of the Women's Network NGO, inaugurated in downtown Los Angeles, with funds donated by his family and other companies moved by the story that had become known throughout the region. The Maria Project had expanded into a complete program of professional training, psychological support, and job reintegration. It had already benefited over 200 women in 3 years of operation. Stephanie was in a classroom, giving a workshop on self-esteem to a group of 15 women. Chuck watched through the glass door as she led the activity with naturalness and genuine affection. The difference between humiliating and educating, she was saying, is that humiliating seeks to make a person smaller, while educating seeks to elevate them. When someone tries to humiliate you, remember, that says more about that person's insecurity than it does about your value. One of the participants raised her hand. "Stephanie, how did you discover this?" "Because I was the person who did the humiliating," she replied with honesty. "And I only understood my mistake when I realized I was trying to feel bigger by making other people feel smaller." Chuck walked away from the door, smiling. Stephanie had found her purpose, to use her personal experience to help other women recognize and escape abusive situations. He walked to the top floor of the building where the project's administrative office was. Maria was behind a modern desk, reviewing financial reports and spreadsheets. At 47, she radiated a confidence she had never been allowed to show when she worked in private homes. "Mr. Miller, it's good to see you. How are things at the company?" "Constantly growing, and here, how are the project's numbers?" "Excellent. This month we managed to place 23 women in formal jobs, 15 of them in administrative positions, 8 in the retail sector. And we have a waiting list of companies that want to hire our graduates." Chuck sat across from Maria's desk, observing the graphs and statistics organized with military precision. "Maria, can I ask you a personal question?" "Of course, Mr. Miller. How can you work with Stephanie every day after everything that happened?" Maria smiled. "Mr. Miller, the Stephanie who works here with me is not the same person who humiliated me 5 years ago. People can genuinely change when they face the consequences of their actions and decide to be better." "Do you really believe that?" "I believe it because I live it every day." Today's Stephanie dedicates 60 hours a week to helping vulnerable women. She uses her own money to fund projects. She listens to stories of abuse without judgment and offers support without condescension. Maria paused, organizing some papers on the desk. "Mr. Miller, Stephanie isn't trying to buy forgiveness or clean her conscience. She has genuinely become a person who uses her privileges to help others. It's the most radical transformation I've ever seen." Chuck nodded. For 5 years he had observed every gesture, every word, every attitude of Stephanie, looking for signs that the change was superficial. He never found them. "And your kids? How are they?" "Leo graduated in engineering and is already working at a multinational company. Anna passed the entrance exam for law at Columbia and wants to specialize in labor rights." "Anna wants to be a labor lawyer?" "She says she wants to defend domestic employees and other vulnerable workers. Our story inspired her to fight for social justice." Chuck smiled, thinking about how a terrible situation had generated positive consequences for future generations. "Maria, there's a question I've always wanted to ask you, but I never had the courage." "You can ask. Do you forgive me for allowing Stephanie to mistreat you for so long without me noticing?" Maria looked directly into Chuck's eyes. "Mr. Miller, you didn't know what was happening. When you found out, you acted immediately to correct the situation. You not only protected me, but you gave me opportunities that changed my entire life. But I should have noticed. Mr. Miller, Stephanie was very good at hiding her behavior, and I was too afraid to tell the truth. You can't be responsible for something that was hidden from you." Chuck stood up, extending his hand toward Maria. "Maria, I want to tell you something." "Go ahead. You are one of the most decent people I have ever met. Your ability to forgive without forgetting, to grow without bitterness, to help other people who go through what you went through, that's extraordinary." Maria shook his hand firmly. "Mr. Miller, I've learned that holding a grudge is like carrying rocks in a backpack. It only makes our path more difficult. I prefer to use my experience as fuel to help other people." When Chuck left the NGO building, the sun was setting over Los Angeles. He walked to his car, thinking about how life had transformed in unexpected ways. 5 years ago, he was a successful businessman, married to a cruel woman he didn't truly know. Today, he was a successful businessman, married to a transformed woman he deeply admired. 5 years ago, Maria was a humiliated and stolen domestic employee in her own home. Today, she was a respected administrator who led important social projects, 5 years ago, Stephanie was an insecure woman who used cruelty to mask her irrelevance. Today, she was a social leader who used her personal experience to empower other women. The most impressive thing was not the individual transformations, but how they had connected to create something bigger. Chuck's discovery had saved Maria. Maria's forgiveness had enabled Stephanie's redemption. Stephanie's change had inspired hundreds of other women. It was as if a stone thrown into a lake created ripples that expanded infinitely. When he got home, Chuck found Stephanie in the kitchen preparing dinner. They had kept the habit of cooking together without domestic employees. It was a way of staying connected to the reality of the work they once disdained. "How was your day?" she asked, giving him a kiss on the cheek. "Productive. I stopped by the NGO and talked to Maria. The project's numbers are impressive. Maria is a born manager. She always was. She just needed a chance." Chuck watched Stephanie seasoning the fish, her movements precise and careful. "Stephanie, do you regret anything?" "Regretting mistreating Maria? Every day. But I don't regret what that experience taught me about myself." "What did it teach you?" "That my value as a person doesn't come from my social position or how much power I have over others. It comes from how I use my opportunities to positively impact people's lives." Chuck hugged Stephanie from behind, feeling the tranquility that came from being with someone he knew completely, including her deepest flaws. "Stephanie, what do you think is the main lesson from our whole story?" She turned in his arms, looking into his eyes. "That true value is not in never making mistakes, but in how you react when you discover your mistakes. We can choose to deny them, minimize them, and keep making mistakes. Or we can choose to face the truth, take responsibility, and use our mistakes as an opportunity for growth." Chuck smiled. "And you chose to grow. We chose to grow together." That night, as they had dinner on the terrace overlooking the city, Chuck reflected on how life had become simpler and at the same time more meaningful. They no longer had the ostentation they once had, but they had something much more valuable: authentic relationships, a genuine purpose, and the peace that comes from living in accordance with their deepest values. Chuck's discovery had begun with the revelation that he didn't know the woman he was living with. It ended with the understanding that true love is not about finding someone perfect, but about choosing to grow alongside someone imperfect. And that sometimes our worst discoveries can become our greatest gifts, if we have the courage to transform them into opportunities for transformation. Chuck Miller slept that night, knowing that he had found something worth more than any material wealth: a life lived with integrity, relationships based on truth, and the certainty that his actions elevate rather than diminish the people around him. True value, he had learned, is not in what we accumulate, but in what we contribute to making the world a better place. And that made all the difference.